everyone, and welcome to our training, Mitigating Insider Threats in Government Agencies. My name is Emily Jarvis, and I'm the Senior Manager for Events here at GovLoop. And today I have the added pleasure of also being your moderator. So thanks so much for joining me. And a special thank you to our partners at Splunk and Cumulus for helping us put on this session today. So let's get to it because government agencies face an evolving landscape of cybersecurity threats, with insider threats posing some of the most complex challenges, whether driven by malicious intent or negligence. Insider threats can compromise national security, disrupt operations, and of course, expose sensitive data. So agencies must adopt proactive strategies to mitigate these risks effectively. And that's what our experts are going to be talking about today. They're going to be sharing their best practices and lessons learned for managing those insider threats. But before we get to all of that good stuff, I do have a few housekeeping items to go over with you all. So, first things first, we have some great resources available for you under the resource button on the bottom panel. This is also where you can learn more about our speakers. Along that bottom panel is also where you can find the closed captioning feature. Just look for that show captions icon. If you have any technical difficulties, send us a message through that Q&A tab and my colleague Maddie will get your questions answered. But here is the secret sauce, friends, because it is in that same portal where you can ask our experts questions. So don't you dare be shy. Put your questions in early and often. You can also, of course, engage with our panelists and your fellow Govies by utilizing that chat feature. Let me know where you're logging in from and what the pollen count is where you are, because I feel like DC right now is pollen central, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Let me know. All right, with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let me introduce you to our speakers. Joining us, we have Jennifer Franks, who is the director for the Center for Enhanced Cybersecurity and Analytics within the Information Technology and Cybersecurity team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. We also have Landon Van Dyke, who's the senior advisor for technology strategies at the U.S. Department of State. Paul Kurtz, who's the Chief Cybersecurity Advisor for Splunk. And last but certainly not least, we have Tu Lu, who's the Chief Product Officer at Cumulus. Thank you all so much for being with us today. So, Jennifer, I'm going to start with you because cybersecurity and insider threats, these are massive challenges, right? And it's not something that is going to be a quick fix. So lay the groundwork for me a little bit. What makes kind of addressing and dealing with insider threats so challenging?
So good question, and I thank you for that. So insider threats is really challenging because insiders typically have legitimate access to the systems and the data. I always say, our agencies and our organizations, we don't know the power we each have within our enterprise when we authenticate into our environments every single day. We have so much access to the various systems that we need to utilize to perform the work that we are responsible for performing. But because we have this access, it makes the actions of someone with, unethical intent to appear as if their actions are normal and they're going around doing their daily activities without malicious intent. But it could be something that they're doing that causes both malicious and unintentional harm because of this access, whether it's the employees or the government contractors or even the stakeholders. It just means that we literally may be missing some triggers on alerts that we need to be paying closer attention to.
Landon, where do you see some of these pain points arising as you're looking at this insider threat landscape? What makes it so challenging, and where do you see some of the biggest problems popping up?
Well, great question. I would say some of the greater challenges, back to what Jennifer was saying, is many people have legitimate access, and whether they are aware of it or not, um, some malicious activities might be happening with their account. Either, malware might be in place and it was put in place because of my account. Well, whatever my account now has access to, that malware has access to it as well. And so many times we don't actually know where things are going to start. And many people, once they get in, they do a lot of lateral movements. They uh, check all the windows, check all the doors, see what other privileges they might be able to elevate and jump into. And so for us, State Department, we operate in 190 countries. We have locally employed staff from most of those countries within our embassies. And so, for us, we're looking at, okay, not only are we worried about someone accidentally leaving something open or bringing something in, but we're doing it in multiple languages. We're doing it with multiple jurisdictions. We're doing it with multiple technologies and internet providers, which some of them actually do share information about IP addresses and where people might be coming in from, and some people don't. And so we do have lots of challenges both with the environment, but then to Jennifer's point, once it could be anybody, anybody's account could be hit, and whatever that account is, it could lead to havoc. And so for us, it's just trying to understand what's the behavior, what is the norm, and then kind of isolate on what are things that are not, out of the ordinary, that are not normal.
Yeah. No, that makes a whole lot of sense. This question gets harder and harder as we go around the horn here. So, too, I'm going to come to you next here. You obviously are working with a bunch of different government partners. Where do you see some of the biggest kind of pain points, and how has this evolved?
Yeah, great question. I think both Jennifer and Landon raised some great points. I think, yeah, fundamentally, what Jennifer said, right? It's the access and permissions or privileges that employees, contractors, and other stakeholders need to have. It's a general security problem, balancing security with the need to be productive, right? The legitimate reasons for all the employees and contractors to have the level of permissions and privileges they need, but how do we balance that with enabling them to be productive? So
Hmm.
that's the underlying problem, right? And it only gets worse. It's exacerbated by advances in technology, right? Resulting in the increase in attack surfaces, more use of cloud, SaaS solutions, mobile remote workers. That just all increases the opportunities for negligence or data loss, data exfiltration, right? So it just gets worse with increases in technology. And of course, we haven't mentioned the 800-pound gorilla in the room, AI technology, right? All of the new risks that come with the use of those technologies as well.
Well, we made it almost 9 minutes without referencing AI. So that might be a record in 2025. So good on you two for bringing that into the discussion. But I think you're exactly right. Obviously, the attack surface has definitely evolved and changed. All right, Paul, you have the unlucky honor of going last here. So I'm going to tweak the question just slightly for you. How has the landscape really shifted on insider threats? Two mentioned kind of the proliferation of technology being everywhere, AI entering the fold. Has that really had a major impact on insider threats, or how do you see this threat evolving over time?
Yeah, it's a super good question, and the foundation that's been placed, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, is ICS 500-27, which puts a healthy foundation in order to combat insider threats. But when you look at how fast technology is evolving to include AI. And you think about adversaries that are able to leverage AI in very creative ways to, in a sense, create like a legitimate person, so to speak,
Hmm.
that can ultimately be um, a part of an agency. I put that in quotations mark, because say, for example, um, we're tripping over people from North Korea that have manufactured a persona for themselves that are becoming employees at companies. Now, government agencies, obviously, well, many government agencies will have more scrutiny over, just exactly who they're employing. But AI makes it a lot easier to appear authentic when you're not. Uh, and on the insider side, on just the operations inside of an agency or a company for that matter, employee use of AI can pose difficulties. In fact, employees being able to look at broader swaths of data inside a government agency that ultimately could be exposed.
Yeah. So, Jennifer, as you all are describing this, it feels a little overwhelming. I'm not gonna lie, it feels difficult. And obviously, and we're gonna get into this, there are lots of best practices and things you do, but it sounds like in a lot of cases that there's a education piece that really has to go along with this for your employees themselves so that they're on the hunt looking for things as well. So, how can you make sure that your team is trained and prepared to deal with the insider threats? I think a lot of times we're talking malicious ones, but sometimes they can be an accidental insider threat or through carelessness or something like that. So, talk to me about the training and development piece of this.
So good question. And you're 100% right. We often, it's easy, especially in the cybersecurity area, and even thinking about AI and the transition of emerging technologies and having to really protect that increased landscape. We are thinking about the more serious risk and the potentiality of the damages that could be caused. But the simplistic things like still folks are clicking on phishing links and or opening documents that could be embedded with some malicious malware of such. So what it is most agencies do and what it has been helpful is we incorporate annually. Everyone has to take a security awareness refresher training, but in that training, we also have an insider threat component. And from an educational perspective, we, really want to encourage people to understand some of the federal guidelines that are in place for all of the agencies collaboratively, and then what specifically your agency needs to do to be better protecting of its data and its informational resources. So every agency has its own critical mission requirements. So we're going to, tailor those trainings adequately to that environment. In Department of Energy with a nuclear weapons laboratory perspective is going to be different from perhaps the Department of Education. But with that, the foundation of that training is really educating people on the different, first, the cybersecurity frameworks. Yes, we're connected to information systems and we have technology. So let's focus on, the robust protocols and systems that we need to implement to make sure that we're mitigating the insider threats from a technologically advanced perspective. But we also then want to educate folks on the best practices that would really help us to establish when we see something to say something. And some of us are still working in a very hybrid environment, whether you are geographically dispersed around the United States or in the office, you can determine if some activities are occurring that perhaps shouldn't be.
Yeah.
So in that training, giving you the resources that you know and that you need to have, that when you see something, you could elevate that to the next level of management and supervisory responsibilities to take heed and some follow-up on those things that you might have seen. And to know that there is no fear of retaliation or retribution for reporting such things. We just have to be good stewards of the agency's environment. So really educating people on the what is and the impact of these types of threats. And then if something happens, where to report, and then how to be helpful in the mitigation approach. So it's an ongoing effort to really educate folks across various organizations, but it really does start with that basic security awareness training.
Yeah. So, Landon, you mentioned 190 countries. You have people coming in and out all of the time. How do you tackle, or can you tackle, this training and development question when it comes to insider threats?
Well, very similar to what Jennifer said, for the State Department, we have annual cybersecurity training. Within the training, we have insider threat modules that will inform people the latest and greatest ways that an insider threat may occur. I would probably tag on to what Jennifer said and say, um, within any enterprise, you usually have a work culture, and the work culture usually is something along the lines of, get along, work well, try to rock the boat. Where an insider threat really does kind of go a little bit against that,
Hmm.
because you're essentially saying what you are doing, my coworker, could be a problem for the enterprise. And nobody really wants to speak up and say something like that. And so sometimes that can be problematic. Um, I do remember one of our contractors, a lot of the projects I work on are experimental. And so one of our contractors wanted to do a new pilot, and they were working on this pilot and they wanted to elevate privileges. And everybody in that line of command were like, okay, well, I guess it's not the norm to elevate your privilege in this particular regard, but we'll do it. And eventually, somehow it got to me, and I was kind of like, well, I hate to be the bad person on the boat, but no, we were not going to elevate your privileges to do this project. You have enough privileges to get it done, to what Tu was saying, but we're not going to just give you carte blanche, administrative rights. And yes, it may help you do it a little faster, but it really endangers the entire enterprise. And so you need to be able to train your folks to be able to step up and say, sorry, I recognize what you're trying to do, and I do want to help you, but at the same time, we need to have the guards in place to prevent insider threats like this from occurring.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. So, Paul, you were referencing some cybersecurity guidelines and frameworks earlier. I'm curious how those play a role, if at all, in kind of these training and development kind of arenas. Are they helpful in that attribute, or how does that work?
Yeah, uh, ICS 500-27 has been around since roughly 2011.
Okay.
And it's, obviously, the government agencies continue to take a look at it, but it sets a robust foundation for looking at insider threats. Its focus is not exclusively insider threats, but there's a lot of meat on the bone there, where it sets out, say, for example, the importance of advanced detection capabilities, um, integration of security and compliance, incident response and accountability, continuous monitoring and risk assessment, prevention through awareness, which we've been talking about quite a bit here, which is vital. And I think in the absence of 500-27, it would kind of be a mishmash of things we might be trying to do in order to counter the insider threat. And so, as a framework, it is in addition to all the discussion of with Jennifer and Landon, it's really important to kind of say, what's the Constitution here that we're looking at that
Hmm.
are going to help us manage insider threat problems. So I highly recommend it. And it has several different elements. It's not all about technology. It gets into awareness as well, as we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think that awareness piece is very key. So, with any change in administration, you're obviously going to have a bunch of new people entering, some folks leaving government. Um, in any time of turnover, things like that, there can be a lot of new folks in a system and a lot of folks leaving that system. What does the training and development look like when you're talking about larger swaths of people kind of coming and going from an organization? It seems like that could be a moment where vulnerabilities might be a little bit more apparent or possible. How
Mhm.
do you think through that kind of training and development piece with kind of turnover happening?
Yeah, I always go back to the fundamentals in times like this, and really a lot of the points are already raised by Jennifer Landon and Paul. The training and awareness education piece, having good policies and procedures in place. I guess I'll sum it up in three easy steps. They sound easy,
Okay.
not so easy to implement, but you want to you want to prevent as much as you can, right? And then you want to detect as early as possible, and then you want to be able to respond as quickly as possible. Right? So that three easy steps, but how do you put all that in place, right? I think you know prevention. So that's where a lot of the training awareness comes in. I think a majority of the situations that arise are not malicious in nature, right? They are due to negligence, carelessness, or in the example that Landon brought up, which I didn't think of, but I think is a good example as well. It's just the convenience factor, right? Doing things, taking shortcuts because it's quicker and easier. So everyone's busy, we're trying to get
Yeah.
a lot done. Yeah, asking for full admin privileges does make things a lot quicker and easier, but
Mhm.
probably not the best from a security perspective, right? So implementing things like least privilege models, separation of duties. That's all basic cyber hygiene sort of things, right? Going back to the fundamentals. Proper account management, reviewing credentials on a regular basis. And that's especially important in times when there's high turnover, right? Because that happens quite a bit. Someone leaves and you forget that they had an account somewhere
Mhm.
and that stays active for a while, right? And we've
Yeah.
seen actual incidents where that is then leveraged by an adversary or maybe some disgruntled coworker to then wreak some havoc. Right? So that's all basic cyber hygiene sort of stuff, going back and focusing on the fundamentals, right? So having those things in place will help on the prevention side, right? But you can't prevent everything. So then how do you detect the things that you can't prevent, right? So how do you detect them as quickly as you can? So that kind of ties into the standards and the guidance that Paul brought up at ICS 500-27. They're having rigorous and comprehensive auditing in place so that you can detect activity as soon as possible to try to catch them. And if you detect things early enough, then maybe you can prevent them as well, right? So having rigorous, comprehensive auditing capabilities in place will be helpful there. And then on the response side, and Jennifer touched on some of this, having policies and procedures in place so that you have a standard SOP for when there is a incident or suspected incident that arises. You have a step-by-step procedure playbook that you follow to address it, investigate it, and also while being sensitive and discreet about it, because there are false positives that arise, right? So you want to be discreet about investigating those incidents that you suspect are insider threat scenarios until you've really confirmed that it was an actual incident. So yeah, just going back to a lot of the fundamentals, basic cyber hygiene things, cyber awareness training to address the carelessness, negligence, desire for convenience, ease of use, and then having some rigorous auditing capabilities in place to detect when there are possible incidents. And then, of course, I'm sure we'll get into more of the technological
Mhm.
solutions
Mhm.
a little bit later on. But yeah, I would recommend focusing on the fundamentals first, policies, procedures in place. Sounds odd coming from a technology vendor, but I'll tell that to our customers. Like, don't look for the shiny object from a technology side if you don't have the fundamental policies and procedures in place, because we can't automate broken procedures, right? Or it would be bad to do so. So people are looking for the automation, the AI, but if you don't have the proper procedures in place, you're automating and increasing the speed of best practices, which is not or increasing the speed of bad practices, which is not a best practice, right? So
No, no.
yeah. So I've said a lot, so I'll pause there. But
No,
some of my
that was
recommendations.
great too. I'm chuckling because we have a toddler, and I think when you have a toddler, you're reading every parenting book so that you can hopefully find some best practices or lessons learned of folks who have gone before you. And there's all of these best practices in place, but toddlers are toddlers and they do their own thing. And I think sometimes what we're talking about when it comes to cybersecurity is you've got all these great policies and procedures in place, but if there aren't checks and balances, just like if there aren't checks and balances with your kids, they're going to go off and do their own thing. And sometimes there's just a wild card in the mix, and you got to be prepared for that as well. So you just had me thinking about the relationship between cybersecurity and toddlers. So that's where my brain went. But I appreciate
It's all related.
all right. So Landon, we have talked about kind of the fundamentals so far. So let's talk about some of the technologies or some of the solutions that can kind of come into play here. So real-time analytics, potentially some automation, maybe some machine learning. How can these type of technologies, AI, how can they play a role here and maybe augmenting or helping to mitigate, when possible, some of these threats?
Well, I would say probably at the very beginning, we keep doing more with computers and we keep doing more with technology, which means there's going to be more activities being recorded. And you can't have just one person or two people sitting there looking through the logs. So at some point, you will need to have artificial intelligence or machine learning or just advanced analytics reviewing the logs and seeing if there's anything that is suspicious or needs a second glance at. I would point out that the technology itself, it's a good thing, but backing up a little bit further, I'd say a good architecture would be a very important thing, right? When we put systems together, many times I'll ask from the perspective of an investigator, if something bad happened here, how would I prove who did it, right? And if I can't prove who did it, we don't have the right logs in place. We don't have the right controls in place. And we'll continue to do it until I can prove in every scenario that we can't think of all of them, but in most of the scenarios, we kind of sit there and go, can I be an investigator right now? Can I prove that this happened by this person? Or, it happened in the library with the candlestick. And if you can't do that, then you might want to look at your architecture of your system and say, okay, what can we do better to ensure that if something bad happens, you can keep an eye on it. But once it is in place, yes, you're going to have all these logs coming in. You're going to have all this information, and at a certain point, we also kind of forget the fact that many people, and I'm sure our Splunk people will agree, many people believe once we have the logs, we set it and forget it. And we don't actually go back and do the training, the training of the models, the training of the alerts. And we don't actually show people, if this happens, this is what it means, and this is what you need to do. And so we tend to forget that part of the process. And so great architecture, recognizing what technology can do for you, but don't let a human stay out of the loop,
Mhm.
and make sure that you actually follow up on ensuring that your training your models correctly so that they're helping you just as much as you suspect that they're supposed to be helping you.
For sure. Paul, I saw you nodding your head along to what Landon was saying there. How do you view the tools as part of this greater kind of ecosystem that we're talking about?
I look, I come from Splunk, so obviously the tools are going to be really critical
Yeah.
to detecting insider threat. But I also think we need to be honest and look at not so long ago, Edward Snowden
Mm-hmm.
uh, pulled off a massive heist of really sensitive data. And if you go back and look through, if you go like online to Perplexity or something like that, one of the AI search engines that they're out there, it really details how someone like Snowden was, an insider, obviously doing devious things, but he was also leveraging technology as
Mm-hmm.
well. And so I do think that we have to keep in mind that, Snowden did things like he used advanced data exfiltration techniques, credential misuse, fabrication of digital keys. Uh, and when we're where we are here in 2025 is we've advanced a significant amount in our ability to use data analytics to um, uh, uh, mine for that gold of someone who's doing the wrong thing. We've come a very long way in our ability to detect anomalies, uh, but we also have to remember. I guess my point is, technology is a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
So as much as, yes, you need to have all the data analytics, very advanced capabilities in place based upon, if you're a more sensitive agency and, have more to lose, obviously you're gonna amp up what you're gonna do as far as technologies. But you have to be mindful that the insider, the insider, the person themselves, uh, may well be a technologist,
Mm.
and it's really important to keep in mind. So a lot of the see something, say something
Uh-huh.
is entirely applicable, but you really do have advanced actors that can be inside of an agency and cause all sorts of destruction. That's a very long-winded answer, but I do think it's important as much as we want to emphasize the importance of technology to detect a problem. We also have to remember that there are people behind a keyboard who may be very advanced in their use of technology.
Yeah. No, I think that's critically important because if we were relying on my technical skills, you'd catch me in an instant. But there are people out there who are very, very capable. So I really appreciate that perspective, Paul. So, Jennifer, let's talk best practices. Let's talk what we can do here. So, what best practices do you have for integrating security and compliance and risk management? It's this teeter totter of you can't say no to everything, obviously, or people are going to go around you, but you've got to keep yourself as secure as and by yourself I mean your agency as secure as you possibly can. So what best practices do you have for creating that proactive defensive posture?
So good question, and kind of compounded on a lot of what we've all collectively said today. You have to have a structured approach to what it is we're going to do to target the potentials of insider threats. And Paul was just correct. There are some internal threats that have very significant technological sophistication beyond their careers, their advancements, including using the Eric Snowden example. He also had a clearance. He had all of the highest level clearances that were provided to a government official. and some of the frameworks that we have to have in place for providing the guidance to who has access to the data, who has access to personally identifiable information, identifying and addressing potential vulnerabilities and the landscape and the likelihood of the new events to evolve with the emerging technologies. We have to really continually implement effective cybersecurity practices. Practicing good cyber hygiene only goes so far if your best practices and your security measures are not effective for the evolution of the threats. You have to think about ways to really look at maintaining cyber resilience through that CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data and of the systems and the information on those systems. So we need to really focus on the insider threats, yes, and the potentiality of all the types of threats that can occur, but even being able to prevent, detect, and respond should something occur. So really looking at the organizational best practices across various agencies. Some of the agencies publicly have more threats than others based on their critical missions, but we have to look at and sometimes use those as case examples or best use scenarios to figure out how do we assess the threat detection and create a better governance model for our enterprise, for our agency, and our critical mission needs. So really looking at, how it is we establish these different programs that really help us to protect the resources. And I go back to the foundation of the resources, always the data in our systems.
All right, two. What additional, Jennifer did a great job running through them, but what additional best practices do you have from your lens? Obviously, you're working with a bunch of different government partners. Where do you see success popping up for agencies as they look to kind of grow that defensive posture?
Yeah, so we've touched on the training, policy, procedure, best practices. So I want to touch a bit on some of the technology components of the solution, right? And we've mentioned logging a couple of times. So obviously logging is fundamental to all of this, right? You need the logging to have the visibility into who's doing what on your networks. There are a lot of technical solutions for logging, Splunk being one of them, of course. But a lot of times people don't know what to log, right? We tell them you should log so that you give them visibility into things, but what do you log? So
Yeah.
that's where a standard like ICS 500-27 comes in. It is a very prescriptive standard on what things to log regarding user activities, entity activities, things like what systems, applications people are accessing, what files and objects people are accessing, changing permissions on, um, what applications people are running, what are they downloading. So it's a very comprehensive auditing standard that pretty much I would say covers all of the areas that you would want to monitor to be able to detect insider threat type activities, right? But then going back to really good point that Landon brought up, really the architecture piece, architecture and requirements, right? So a lot of times that we come into customer organizations, and this is especially true in the case of custom homegrown applications or GOTS applications. If you don't have the architecture and requirements defined up front, they're not logging those things to begin with. And it's very hard to get that data from these custom homegrown applications because the requirements and architecture weren't defined up front for them to log all of these types of things, right? So without the logging, you're missing really that foundational layer from which you can then build all of the more advanced analytics, AI, ML, right? So you got to have the logging in place. You have to know what to log. And if you have questions there, I would recommend looking at the ICS 500-27 standards. If you look at the FedRAMP standards, it pretty much lays out very similar set of events to log. Some of the standards on the DoD side, again, very similar set of things to
Mhm.
log, right? So get that foundational logging layer in place. A tool like Splunk is great for that. From there, then you can start building up that behavioral baseline, right? From that log data that you're collecting, you can start building up that profile of what is normal activity for
Yeah.
users and hosts on your network, right? And then once you've got that normal baseline, then you can start, layering on top the AI ML analytics to detect when there's deviations from those norms. So that's where, again, technologies like Splunk and solutions we've built on top of Splunk really can help there, right? But first, you got to get the data in place. Then you build those baselines. Then you leverage technologies from Splunk and Cumulus where we can help you with the higher level analytics. And then going back to some of the non-technical solutions, right? People have to be trained to use these tools. These tools need care and feeding. You got to have processes defined for when incidents are detected. How do you respond to them? What are the playbooks that people need to follow to respond to these sorts of things? So it's a mix, of technology solutions, policies, procedures. But yeah, so some of the technical things I just recommended would be what I would focus on or recommend that agencies focus on from the technology side.
Understood. All right, we are almost at the end of today's training. So I've got two final questions for each of you. And Landon, I'm going to start with you. We've talked about how the threat landscape has really shifted with the emergence of some of these new solutions and very accomplished cyber threats that are out there right now. So peer into your crystal ball a little bit. What do you see on the horizon as agencies look to continue to obviously mitigate this insider threat challenge? And what do you want attendees who are listening today to take away from today's session?
Well, as much as the cyber threat has increased, um, some of our understanding of how we should be operating our systems has evolved as well.
Oh,
We
great.
have in government, we have zero trust
Mhm.
as a model, which, I look at 500-27 and I think, yeah, they're speaking to zero trust, even though it's like 10 years later, right?
Yeah.
Um, so we are starting to apply some of the structured basics, as Tu was saying. When we had the policy in place, we were like, okay, we know we need to implement this, but perhaps the technology is not ready yet for us to do it all the way.
Mhm.
And now we're kind of at that place where, yes, we can start to apply more AI, um, and more machine learning. But again, all of this goes back to if you're not training it right, and to Tu's point, if you're not feeding it and you're not watering it properly, it's not gonna do you any good. You're gonna have a false sense of security because you think the alarms are gonna go off and then the police are gonna come running in, and when something bad happens, nothing happens, and you're not even aware of it, right? So like an insider threat is essentially the human version of a 0 day
Yep.
problem, right? So
Mhm.
we don't know what our employees are doing sometimes, so we need to make sure we're restricting their privileges, where we need to make sure that they're getting everything they need, but not anything more than that. These are the basics in cyber, hygiene. Um, but yeah, for the future, people are just bad things are going to happen faster.
Yeah.
And as I was saying before, when I get in, if I've seen an intruder get into our systems, they try to knock on all the doors, right? I've seen it where humans are the people that are intruders, right? So, we're to Tu's point, we have Splunk and logging in our systems where if you're an intruder and we're alerted to it, we can watch your movement, right? And we're watching your movement and we're seeing check this out, check this out, check this out. But in the future, a lot of that will be automated. And in fact, some of it was automated when we were watching it. And so that means all of a sudden your 125 systems can get checked within like 5 minutes to see if they have any flaws in their configuration, right? And all of a sudden bad things happen in multiples versus when it was the one or two person inside and they're checking everybody's door individually and they're running their particular script against your system. So bad things will happen faster. We just need to make sure that we're staying on top of feeding and taking care of things, and then making sure that we're actually doing our due diligence both in architecture, training, and our modeling. So
Understood. All right, Paul, peer into the future for me and then give me your takeaway from today's session.
I have to come back to AI.
Okay.
No, it sounds like a bit of a cop out, but I think with you know by as early as 2026, we'll have the possibility of artificial general intelligence, meaning computers are going to be smarter than people. And when you take that in the context of putting computers to work to harvest data from the outside or from the inside. I think gaining some semblance of control is going to be difficult. Um, it's really important that we put guardrails in place sooner rather than later. And guardrails almost don't, it almost doesn't sound like enough.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like, there's got to be full stop on certain capabilities within certain agencies, or and not just agencies, but inside corporations as well. And in addition to AGI, we also have uh, agentic AI, where computers will be acting on their own.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
if you couple artificial general intelligence with agentic AI, you and let's say you're a bad actor person, you could really potentially cause much wider problems than we even saw in the context of Edward Snowden. It doesn't all have to be about an intelligence agency. It can be about, big pharma taking down several rungs because somebody's gotten a hold of the data. Manufacturing techniques, high tech development, what we do on development of new chips and the like. So I think we're set for a pretty bumpy road ahead. On one hand, AI is super exciting. I think most people leverage it in one way, shape, or form to help them perform their tasks. But what's right around the bend is something totally different than what we're playing with today.
All right. That's a little ominous, Paul, but I don't think you're wrong by any means. But I'm gonna be like peeking around corners, looking for what's next for sure. All right, two, what's your prediction and what do you want folks to take away from today's session?
Yeah, I think my predictions are similar to Paul's.
Yep.
The threat of AI, the threat and the opportunities,
Yeah.
right? So double-edged sword there. So Paul explained that well, so won't cover that again. But key takeaways, I think I mentioned earlier, fundamentals: prevent, detect, and respond, right? So prevention, basic cyber hygiene, best practices, least privilege, separation of duties, things like that. Detection, logging, auditing, analytics, AI, ML models, and then respond, having good SOPs, playbooks in place, and then that's where you can again leverage some technologies, orchestration, automation to respond quicker. Like one of the points Landon brought up, we need to be able to respond quicker to things. So that's again where you can leverage some of the technologies to help with that automation to lock out an account, quarantine a device, et cetera, when things are detected. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'll stop there at risk of being long-winded. So prevent, detect, and respond. So
I love it. I love it. All right, Jennifer, you get to have our closing word here, which is an honor and yet the most difficult role to be in. So give me your prediction, as well as your takeaway.
I agree with everybody, to be honest. Everyone's really given some important nuggets, and I see the quote about the
Uh-huh.
better threat being the human equivalent of a 0 day, and it's so true. But going back to AI, but even the other emerging technologies, and us continuing to be in a hybrid environment, being aware of, I saw the chat part about folks turning off their Alexa at home and just
Yep.
being cognizant of the tools and the technologies and the smart devices around us. I think we're going to have to just continually be aware, keeping our heads on a swivel, so to speak.
Mhm.
We can talk about cybersecurity best practices and even internal organizational standard operating procedures and such, but the fundamentals of just being aware of your surroundings, being aware of your role that you play with your current roles and responsibilities, and even your future state ones, and just being cognizant of how you're accessing the data within the systems, and even how then you're sharing that information, how you're storing it, how you're transmitting it, and such. So, really, just in the future state of insider threats, we're going to continually have this discussion to be just more aware and educating folks on what it is we need to do just to stay ahead of the curve so that we are just protecting our most critical resources across our various agencies and such.
I appreciate that. You're
Absolutely.
getting a lot of head nods, so I think we are all in agreement. And I love to see that, of course. For Paul and Tu and Jennifer and Landon, thank you all so much for sharing your insights with us today. You certainly gave me a lot to think about, and I know you did for our attendees as well. So thank you for sharing your big brains with us. Before everyone logs off, though, I have a few quick reminders. First things first, if you haven't already, take a look at that resources tab. There are some great resources there for you to download, lots of incredible learning opportunities. So make sure you are checking those out. We'll also be sending you a link to the on demand version of this training tomorrow. So make sure you look for that in your inbox. But on behalf of GovLoop, Splunk, and Cumulus, we hope you enjoyed today's session. And as always, we really appreciate and value the work that you do. So thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next training. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
All right.